welcome everybody to this episode of the Vitamin D3 and Me podcast. We're delighted, honored, and very thankful to have Dr. Vatsal Thakkar, MD, founder and chief medical officer of startup company Reimbursify, and a longtime vitamin D practitioner and advocate, and has done a ton of reading and background and writing on this subject of vitamin D3 and vitamin D, and in many different areas of health, and also as it relates to COVID. So, Dr. Thakkar, thank you kindly for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So with that, if you could give us a little bit of your background and why, as a psychiatrist, you're so interested in vitamin D research and some of the writing you've done and the research you've done and what you've gleaned from that.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been practicing for almost 18, 20 years now. And it was back in 2007 that I opened my own office, a small private practice in New York City. And I've always had one foot in the medical model in my practice. So yes, I treat psychiatric patients, but I want to make sure that they don't have anything medical going on. So I routinely would order baseline lab tests on people, because many deficiencies are known to contribute to psychiatric issues like low B12, low iron, anemia, thyroid hormone abnormalities. And so early on in that practice, vitamin D became an interest because here was a vitamin that everyone, a lot of people are deficient in. And it's a vitamin that greatly affects every organ system, we're realizing, but also the brain. And this, along with the fact that there were tons of correlation studies. Now, correlation doesn't always imply causation. But sometimes it does, and we'll get to that with COVID. But there were tons of correlation studies that, where people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar, people with depression, all had low vitamin D levels compared to controls. And I just thought it was good practice to, if I'm treating them psychiatrically, I just want everything to be in the optimal zone. Their B12, their iron level, their thyroid level, and their vitamin D level. And so that's the way I've been practicing in the decade that I had that New York City practice.
Excellent. And when we talk about comparative studies, et cetera, correlational studies, can you unpack that a little bit further in terms of what they actually do and what they mean for the audience?
Right. So a correlation study means that these two things happen simultaneously, but that doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So an example would be, let's say someone had a very severe orthopedic injury, from a car accident or something, and they were bedridden for 6 months. Well, if you're bedridden for 6 months, you're probably not getting out in the sunlight, and your vitamin D level is going to start dropping over those 6 months. So, a study could say, people who are in car accidents have lower vitamin D levels than others, severe car accidents. We don't know anything about the physiology of a fracture or orthopedic injuries that actually decreases your vitamin D level directly, but that would be more of an association that probably is not causative. So that would be sort of an independent variable, an interdependent variable. Whereas in some situations, like the massive vitamin D study done by Mass General Hospital researchers, where tens of thousands of people supplemented with 2,000 units a day of vitamin D3. Overall, the message was it didn't really help. But if you look at subpopulations in that study and specific diagnoses, for example, just a few months ago, they published an analysis from that data set that showed vitamin D supplementation at that dose reduces cases of advanced or fatal cancer. And they found this mostly in people who were normal weight. And, there's a plausible explanation for that as well. Simply being that people who are overweight, it's known that they need higher doses of vitamin D for their levels to normalize, higher than 2,000 units a day. And so that's as direct causative and not just correlative data as you can get. You have a massive study, you have reputable researchers, independently funded, right? They're funded by the NIH, not by pharma or supplement makers. And you see a signal, and you have to assume, given that that's as good a study as anyone could have hoped for, showing this strong signal, that that's causative proof in that one particular circumstance. So that in a nutshell, that would be the difference between a purely correlational study like the motor vehicle accident victim versus a positive result like that Mass General study with 20-something thousand participants.
And then as it relates to D3 in your own practice, when you begin in, I believe you said 2007, looking at sort of nutritional, not necessarily therapies, but interventions or supplemental adjunct introduction of these products into the overall holistic regimen for your patients, what did you start finding, or what did you see happen, macro or micro level?
Sure. So macro level, the first thing I realized is that everything we learned about vitamin D is wrong, like the daily recommended requirement. The fact that, the normal levels might just be a guess. Then, if some people say 20 is normal, some people say 30, that's nanograms per milliliter is normal. And some people are saying 50 to 60 is normal. And then
different ranges, different blood ranges.
Right. And so, you basically quickly realize everything you've been taught about vitamin D is wrong. And you have to figure out your own way. I mean, back then there was less guidance available. And so it just came from, giving people supplements, then testing their levels, and then maybe giving them more supplements and testing their levels and how they feel. And, all along the toxic range is above 100. So I've never gotten anyone, intentionally or accidentally to a level above 100. And what I noticed is, I didn't have a comparator group in my practice. It's not like I selected half of them and said, I'm not going to fix your vitamin D.
Some ethics issues associated with that, right?
I don't want to extrapolate just from my own anecdotal evidence, but I would say I grew my practice as being thorough, holistic, and getting good results. So I think that having optimized nutritional levels aids in the recovery from psychiatric conditions, even though they do require often medication, psychiatric medication for that. You wouldn't.
So it's never really been a replacement. It's more of an adjunct or supplemental.
Exactly. It's an adjunct. There have been some cases where it feels like the vitamin D had a more profound effect than in other patients, and that's when people had levels very low. I would say below 10 or below 15, and typically that benefit came in the form of again, I haven't. This is not a formal study that I did on the patients I saw over 10 years, but it felt like those results were in the form of increased energy levels. And so I don't think I know of someone who has done an official study on that, but there's a lot of case reports and anecdotal studies. Like, for example, a sleep specialist published some case reports on low vitamin D levels mimicking narcolepsy and excessive daytime sleepiness, and so I think there is something there.
And in the area of psychiatry, which I know is a broad spectrum, but did you see any interesting, again, anecdotal, of course, but did you see any interesting trends within certain subpopulations in psychiatry, or was it more across the board from what you saw in your own practice?
It was across the board, but what I saw in subpopulations were, what is typically reported. The older someone is, the lower their vitamin D level. So everyone has a mildly low vitamin D level on average, right? Mm-hmm. I think, let's say 29, which is just under the normal range. But if you are older or heavier or darker skinned, I would see levels, the lowest level I think I tested was someone with a level of 4 or 5 nanograms per milliliter. And he was a, Indian physician, actually like myself, probably a little darker skinned than me. And he was stunned and I was stunned, that someone, high functioning, walking around, with a good job and well-to-do has a level that low. And what happens when people are successful? They work a lot. And when you work a lot, you're not getting much sunlight. And then, hey, if you're a little overweight and you have dark skin, then even that little bit of sunlight is not really helping your vitamin D level much.
And that's very interesting. And in this particular case, what is it about how vitamin D works? It seems to touch a lot of different buckets, if you will, or health line items. So did you see just improvement in one key area, or it seems like it's an underpinning type situation where it can affect multiple areas simultaneously?
I believe it can affect multiple areas simultaneously. And I would say that given what I've experienced through the practice and read about vitamin D deficiency in psychiatric conditions, is that having a normal vitamin D level is probably protective against developing or a worsening psychiatric condition. So I still, advocate for, especially when I'm weaning someone off of some sort of form of psychiatric meds, I again want to double check and make sure that all of their levels, iron, B12, thyroid, vitamin D, are not just sufficient, but in optimal ranges.
Oh, for sure. And if we're switching to more bigger picture now, beyond your practice and the work that you've done in some of the op-eds and medical op-eds that you've written, amongst other articles and publications, take us through some of the sort of more high-profile ones that you feel were super intriguing that people should know about and be aware of, such as the one with former Surgeon General Dr. Carmona.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one other thing, though, I'd like to say about what I learned in the course of that practice, if I could.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, so I opened the practice, and a couple years in, I wanted to know my own vitamin D level. And so I went to my doctor, and he actually talked me out of it. He said, you're healthy, it's a waste of money. He was treating it like it's, the latest fad. And so I didn't get my level checked, but, within a year of that, I ordered my own test. I could do that as a physician. So
that's right.
I tried to go through the appropriate channels, but it didn't work. So I ordered my own test, and I found that my level, and this was in August, so it was right after a full summer, my level was 11 nanograms per milliliter. And I was also, I thought I'd be in the high 20s like most people. And so I was kind of shocked to learn that I not only had a deficiency, but most scales call that a severe deficiency. And so that was 8.5 years ago. And since then, I've been even more focused on vitamin D and the deficiency states and supplementation to correct that.
Interesting. And you mentioned one other point I just want to tap into as well, is when you talk about the spectrum of darker skin tones, what is the science of vitamin D and how it plays into seemingly greater deficiencies as the skin tone becomes darker?
Right. So that's a great question. And so I can address all of those, that one and why the heavier you are, meaning body weight, how that affects it, as well as age. So vitamin D is, most vitamin D that we get is not from food. So that's another misconception, that a lot of people think, well, I have a healthy diet, so I can't be vitamin D deficient. No, you can absolutely be vitamin D deficient, unless you're eating salmon 3 meals a day, and maybe even then you'd still be vitamin D deficient. So most of it's generated in our skin from sunlight exposure, direct sunlight, and it has to be at a certain angle, because if the sun is low in the sky, the UVB rays, ultraviolet B rays, get filtered out by our atmosphere, and that's one of the problems about wintertime in the northern hemisphere, which I can mention in a minute. But so direct sunlight hits your skin and converts a specific cholesterol molecule into vitamin D. And then that gets further processed by the liver and kidneys into different active forms. But that's the main source of vitamin D for the majority of humanity, and has been for millennia. And what impedes that process? One thing is having darker skin. So you have lighter skin than me. So if we're both sitting, with similar attire outdoors in summertime, I would need to be out there twice as long as you to make the same amount of vitamin D, because my skin is darker, and officially it's there's a Fitzpatrick scale of skin tone. There's a six level range, and you would be a 1 or a 2, and I would be a 4. And someone who's African American might be a 5 or 6. And so the darker your skin, the more time you need in the sun, because melanin in the skin blocks ultraviolet light. So it's protective in that way, because ultraviolet light can be damaging. However, like everything in medicine, we need the right dose of everything, not too little, not too much. And so that's how dark skin affects vitamin D production. So the average, the last study I looked at, this is probably a decade old now, but the average person with white skin in America has a vitamin D level of 26, and the average African American has a level of 16. And there can be other factors there, but skin tone is a big factor in that disparity. So one of the other factors is being overweight or obesity. And because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, fat cells sequester it. So it gets sucked up by fat cells. Now, historically, evolutionarily, this was probably because, we fed or overfed in the summertime and gained some fat cells. And then we had a leaner winter. And so we would release not only calories from our fat cells, but probably vitamin D from our fat cells, because there's less direct, proper angled sunlight in the wintertime. And so, but nowadays, a lot of us, myself included, and it probably contributed to my level being so low, is that I'm in the overweight category. And so I need more vitamin D to have it available to my, the rest of my body, and not just my fat cells. And then the final group that has a biological reason for deficiency is people over the age of 60, because that cholesterol molecule in the skin decreases. So some studies have shown that it decreases by 50%. So if there's less raw material for you to make vitamin D as you age, then you're going to have lower vitamin D levels.
So generally speaking, people with darker skin tones that are over the age of 60 that have issues with weight management, they're super prone for vitamin D deficiency by any measure. And so
absolutely,
if they happen to be living in a more northern state in the US or in some other country that isn't near the equator, and they're getting this sunlight that isn't optimally angled, how would they create sufficiency for themselves? What dose would they look at? And I know every case is unique, but what would your approach be if you're the individual consumer and you fit into one or more of those categories?
No, that's a great question, and I've probably explained the nuances around this patient by patient over 1,000 times.
Okay. Can you do 1,001 for us, Doc?
Well, I'm happy to do that, but I also wanted to say, especially with the focus on vitamin D and my publications since the pandemic started, I've actually put a personalized vitamin D dose calculator on my website. So it takes into account how old you are, where you live, your BMI, so your body weight category, your skin tone, and then it will spit out an estimated daily dose for people to stay in the sufficient range. So if your question, if someone had super dark skin and were in the obese category and were 70, let's say 70 years old and lived in Canada, I don't want to get into practicing medicine on this recording, but I would probably be guiding them to take somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 units a day of vitamin D3.
Right. And one of the things I've always found interesting with the federal recommendations or guidance around dosing of any type, it's a fairly broad brush. So both in Canada and the US, when we look at accepted and approved, in some cases pre-approved dose recommendations around certain claim language or what we're telling the consumer to take, I don't think it's that formulaic or algorithmic that it's taken into account all these variables. They're pretty broad brush statements about dosing recommendations, but probably also 15, 20, 25 years old that the science went into spitting that number out. And now we're at the point in the area of personalized nutrition where these more advanced, individualized calculations can take place that are multifactorial, multivariable, and get a more customized dose recommendation for the individual. And I think that's what you're describing here. So you've developed amongst certain sets of data and criteria a way to come up with an individualized number that's likely far more accurate than what's in some federal guideline as to what the healthy adult population should be taking.
Right, absolutely. And I've based it on available studies. In fact, one of them, of over 20,000 people who supplemented with vitamin D in Canada, and them observing what their blood levels did in response to what level of dosage. And that's been very illuminating for providing this type of guidance, along with, the other factors like body weight, skin tone.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and so I think medicine's been myopic a lot of the time, and it continues to be, and it drives me crazy. And so when the vitamin D guidelines were created, it was for one reason only, and that was to prevent bone deformities known as rickets. And you don't need much vitamin D to prevent bone deformities.
It's like vitamin C and scurvy.
Right, exactly. We don't need vitamin C because no one dies of scurvy anymore. That's kind of the logic. But that's incorrect. So I like to look at it, and a lot of researchers and practitioners look at it this way, who are more vitamin D, who favor vitamin D, is that, well, what's our natural level supposed to be? Let's not look at how much we need to prevent bone disease, but what's our natural level supposed to be? So if you look at, Aboriginal tribes in Africa, or, lifeguards in the Western world, people who are, out in the sun every day, which is how our species has evolved. They have blood levels between 40 and 80 nanograms per liter. And, if you follow the government guidelines, maybe you'll get to 20. I think in I think in England, I might not be right about this, but I think it's even lower. I think they want people above 12, which seems really pathetically low. But you might get to 20, and you'd be lucky if you got to a level of 30 following the official guidelines. And so, what does it really take to get people into the 40 to 60 sweet spot, which actually shows to be a great zone for immune health optimization, which has been a great focus of the world for the last 12 to 14 months.
Oh, absolutely. And then to that end, then how has all your vitamin D3 or vitamin D reading and research you mentioned earlier that it sort of resurfaced and rekindled with the pandemic, tie the vitamin D science back into COVID from your perspective, from everything you've read?
Sure, no, absolutely. So, even prior to the pandemic, the connections between vitamin D and immune system were known to, the scientific community and even to me in my practice. If you practice psychiatry, you see a lot of people with autoimmune conditions and, who also happen to have depression or fatigue or other psychiatric concerns. And so my vitamin D optimization recommendations have helped people. It's funny to see a psychiatrist and then they help, your rheumatologic condition by optimizing your vitamin D level, but that used to happen a lot. And then I even have family members who have autoinflammatory conditions. So I've known that connection prior to the pandemic. And it was almost exactly a year ago that I saw the first, news that COVID is affecting Black people more severely than white people. And my first immediate impulse was, there's a vitamin D connection here. Because yes, there are disparities in how, on average, Black people and white people in the US, I'm speaking of, might be more exposed to COVID. They might suffer racism in the healthcare system. They might not even have access to the healthcare system. I agree with all that. But that's not going to give you a 3 times death rate between the two. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I immediately thought there's something biological here, and it could be connected to vitamin D. I wasn't sure at the time. I formulated some thoughts. I looked up everything that was available last April, and I published that initial op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, basically titled "Vitamin D and COVID-19 Disparities." And it harkened back to the last pandemic of this scale from 1918. And I'm still not sure why people don't pay more attention to this. 100 years ago, we didn't really have healthcare disparities. There really was no healthcare. And 100 years ago, the mortality rate from the Spanish flu pandemic increased the more north you went, from Texas to Connecticut. And so there's basically what appears to be a latitude gradient. And in an era where there was no medicine, there were no hospital ICUs. I mean, the ICU was invented from that pandemic, I think, because of that pandemic. Why were people in Connecticut dying at 4 times the rate of people in Texas 100 years ago? In addition, there was a field hospital set up in Massachusetts that had an outdoor recovery ward, and they saw a 40% decline in mortality between patients who were outdoors versus indoors.
Wow.
And so I packaged all this up and got that published last April. And I thought, this will just spur people who are in the know, who are in leadership, to take this into account, I thought it would snowball on its own because it's relatively cheap and low risk, right, to make sure people are vitamin D sufficient.
Yes.
and it didn't happen, unfortunately. And in fact, people poo-pooed it, and I encountered more resistance than I expected, given that this was early in the pandemic. There was no treatments, anything that could even possibly be helpful wasn't really taken seriously.
Interesting, because I always find with those types of interventions that are nutritionally grounded, there seem to be a lot of voices that rise up quickly if someone's putting something forward, more often than not. But when one is making or one is introducing this type of intervention or adjunct, not necessarily therapy, but adjunct solution or supplemental solution, even if you knock off 0.5% or 1% from mortality data, we call that body count data. That's significant for those individuals. It's highly significant. So no, it's not 80% efficacy or something like that, but even a couple of points makes a huge difference in some pretty important categories as these things play out statistically. And that's what people often forget. On millions of patients, 0.5% is kind of a big deal, or 0.25%. Yeah.
And here we are almost a year later from when I published that, and we're pretty confident that percentage is much more than 0.5%.
Yes,
because if we fast forward the last, over the summer, I got introduced to other people, doctors and researchers who were interested in this from all around the world. By late summer, early fall, we were all, trying to warn people that not to get complacent, because it seemed like we had licked the virus in the US because the hospital and death rates were down, and people
Canada, same thing.
We must be doing something great. We have great treatments, and a lot of us were saying, I hope to be proven wrong, but just wait, because as sunlight decreases, we're going to have a massive spike. And obviously that's unfortunately what we saw. But I started this collaborating with people all across the world on this, and a few things came out of that. One was, there's now over 200 scientists and doctors from around the world who've signed this open letter advocating for governments to push vitamin supplementation around the world, specifically for COVID. And that's vitaminDforall.org, organized by, it's all pro bono. None of us, some of us are researchers, but there's no financial component to it. We just want to get the word out that if you can't figure out the dose you should take, or not sure, people can take up to 4,000 units a day, and without medical supervision and without side effects. And that's safe to do. And if everyone in the world did that, COVID would be, divided by half, if not better, around the world. So that's our main point there.
Have any of those governments? We have a group of 200 scientists, medical doctors, PhDs in this group. Has any government favorably responded, or which government or which regions have most favorably responded, or has it been largely ignored from your perspective?
So it's been, there's been small victories, but not to the extent that we would have hoped. So Spain and France decided to advocate for supplements in certain populations. The UK, there's a member of parliament there who has been very, who resonates with this and has a scientific background and is pushing it there. And then the UK is also sending out supplements to the people who need them. Unfortunately, they're sending out too small of a dose, in our opinion, but there's been some.
It's a start.
It's a start. Yeah, it's a start. In the U.S., in the chief medical officer of the state of Nebraska back in November recommended out loud, and we were thrilled that he did, that you need to normalize your vitamin D level before you come to the hospital with COVID. And he recommended 4,000 to 5,000 units a day to do that to his whole state. There's a town in Texas, Rowe, Texas, is testing city workers to see what their level is and supplementing them because they don't want the government workers to catch COVID and have poor outcomes. And there's a U.S. congressman who's introduced a resolution advocating for vitamin D to help fight COVID, Glenn Grothman. And it seems to be stalled. There doesn't seem to be a lot of excitement around it, even though it's a resolution that doesn't really hold any legislative weight. It's just a pronouncement of a fact. But it's still lost in the press. So the other, we said, okay, how else can we get this word out, right? Like, what's a louder bell that we can ring? And through this group, I got introduced to Surgeon General Richard Carmona, who served 15 years ago or so. And he's been very interested in nutritional remedies, both preventative and as potential treatment in his career. And he was very interested in the vitamin D data that we had, and I was sending to him. And it was, and keep in mind, since April of last year, literally every week, there's been more vitamin D data that comes out. Now, it's probably split 80-20 in favor of vitamin D. So there are the studies that come out negating it, but there's really no study that says you should have a low vitamin D level. By negative study, I mean, it says we don't see a difference in having a low versus a normal vitamin D level, or taking or not taking supplements. Right. It's a no effect study.
Unfavorable outcome. Yeah. Interesting.
Right. And that's where we have some frustrations there because people are judging vitamin D as if they're judging a new pharmaceutical, where the evidence bar should be higher. But we don't think so in vitamin D's case. But anyway, Dr. Carmona and I had many emails and a few phone calls, and he was interested in writing something together. And of course, I was interested in having him put his name on vitamin D as favorable in COVID-19. And John Umhow, who introduced us and is a former NIH researcher as well as commander in the U.S. Public Health Service, the three of us co-authored an op-ed 2 months ago, which basically the title says it all. Don't let your COVID-19 patients die with vitamin D deficiency. And the message is, if you know they're deficient, just like if they're dehydrated or if they have anemia, you would fix that when they come into the hospital, and you would fix it aggressively. And that's what these patients need regarding their low vitamin D status. I mean, they're not even having their vitamin D levels checked. So it's easy to not do something when you don't know, you're not aware that a deficiency exists. And this came on the heels of at least two prominent studies that showed if you aggressively correct vitamin D deficiency, ICU admission rates and mortality rates drop significantly. It was a small study that showed greater than 50% reduction. And the other study showed that people clear the virus. 3 times as many people cleared the virus within 2 weeks. So they were testing negative if they took aggressive vitamin D supplementation. And so our point was twofold. We need to identify and treat it, and you need to do it aggressively because, some of the studies that showed no effect, they gave either too little vitamin D or they gave it too late in the disease process.
Yeah, timing is everything.
Absolutely. You don't take an antibiotic after you're in the ICU with an infection, right? You take the antibiotic to keep you out of the ICU with an infection.
Absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense. Well, as we wrap up here, Dr. Thakkar, and this has been great, amazing insights. Really appreciate your time. What sort of final message or concluding message would you like to share with us as it relates to this fascinating area of vitamin D and COVID and vitamin D science in general?
Thanks. It's been great to have this conversation. And as you can see, I'm passionate about it. And I have no, I'm not selling anything. It's a free vitamin D calculator on my website. I was recently, cryptocurrency has been in the news a lot. And I texted a friend recently saying that vitamin D is like the cryptocurrency of health. And what I mean by that is that it's been underappreciated. Some people think it's BS, but in the end, it has the potential to provide huge rewards and gains. And so in summary, vitamin D has been underappreciated and underdosed, and most of us are deficient. And at the very least, get your level checked. And there's no reason not to know your vitamin D level. It's easy to get ordered by your care practitioner or even through a home testing kit, which in most countries you can get for $20 or $30. And once you know your level, then you can realize if you're one of the 40% around the world really who have vitamin D deficiency, and then what you're going to do to fix that. And it's pretty easy to do.
And then if someone is taking up the cause for themselves, they feel empowered and enabled, get their vitamin D level checked, and they're deficient or outside of the normal range that the test report is saying, and they get on a dose that they've calculated, how long should they wait until they get retested to see if they've corrected their deficiency?
That's a great question. So typically 2 months would do it if it's a standard daily dose. There's ways to boost your level quicker, by accelerating your dosage for a month. But ignoring that, if it's a standard daily dose, 2 months is safe to wait until a retest. And one final thing, I'd love to end on is that the recommended dose in the United States for someone who's 80 years of age is 800 IUs of vitamin D. And Dr. Fauci is 80 years of age. He might be 81 now. And he takes 6,000 IUs of vitamin D per day. So why that disparity? Why was he deficient? And why is he not telling everybody in the country and in the world that they should do this?
Interesting. Well, on that final thought, we'll let that one dangle out there. Great point. Really appreciate it. And thanks again so much for your time and your insights. They were fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think it's a great series that you're doing.